My father didn't shout when he threw me out. He stood in the doorway, rain pushing against the screen behind him, and said it the way you'd cancel a subscription. Leave. I won't raise a broken daughter. Broken. Not angry. Not confused. Broken. The storm outside was loud enough to shake the windows. Thunder rolled through the house like something heavy being dragged across the sky. My mother didn't argue. She held my younger sister Claire while Claire cried into her shoulder. I showed you the messages, Claire whispered. She hates me. I didn't. But I also didn't cry. And in our house, tears were evidence. Silence was guilt. Dad, I said carefully, because I had learned careful. You know I wouldn't do that. He looked at me like he was looking at a stranger. That's what scares me. The door opened. Wind rushed in. And just like that, I was no longer a daughter. I was a problem removed. 3 hours later, the police would call them from the hospital. By then, I would be unconscious. And when my father walked into that emergency room and saw who was sitting beside my bed, his hands started shaking so badly he had to grab the wall to steady himself. You, he whispered. He hadn't expected him. But before I tell you who he saw and why it mattered, I need you to understand something. This didn't begin with a storm. It began with a pattern. If you're listening right now, maybe from Florida, maybe from Oregon, maybe from somewhere far from where I am, and you know what it feels like to be the easy child, the one who adjusts so everyone else can breathe, stay with me. Strength doesn't beg, it builds. Subscribe for strength. Because this story isn't about revenge. It's about what happens when the quiet one stops shrinking. And that part takes time. I learned early that in our house, Claire's feelings arrived first. If she was upset, the temperature of the room shifted instantly. Conversations paused. Plans adjusted. My parents moved toward her like gravity had changed direction. I was the opposite of gravity. I was space. I didn't demand much. I didn't raise my voice. I understood, even as a child, that stability was my role. When I was 10, I won first place in a regional writing contest. I remember standing in the kitchen holding the certificate, waiting for the right moment to show it. Claire came in crying about a group project gone wrong. My mother bent down immediately, cupped her face, asked what happened. My father frowned in concern. I stood there holding proof that I existed outside that house, and slowly lowered it back to my side. It wasn't cruelty. It was pattern. Patterns are more powerful than isolated incidents. Over time, you stop expecting applause. You start measuring yourself by how little space you take up. If you've ever been the one who doesn't need anything, you understand how invisible that role can become. Some of you listening right now learn to self-regulate before you learn to ask for help. Tell me where you're listening from tonight, what state, what city, because quiet children grow up everywhere. By middle school, Claire's sensitivity had become part of the family narrative. She just feels things deeply, my mom would say. The unspoken comparison was that I did not, but that wasn't true. I felt deeply too. I just learned not to externalize it. When I was 14, I got accepted into a competitive summer academic program. Full scholarship. 2 weeks at a university campus. I was proud in a way that felt dangerous. Claire read the acceptance email over my shoulder. So you're leaving? She asked. It was an accusation. Not yet. Just question. That night at dinner, she barely ate. She stared at her plate and said, "It must be nice to always be the favorite." The irony almost made me laugh. My parents looked confused, then concerned. Maybe next year would be better, my mother suggested gently. Claire's been struggling. I said I understood. Of course I did. I always understood. And every time I stepped back, the story inside our house rewrote itself slightly. Claire became the fragile one. I became the distant one. She was protected. I was assumed. That's how erosion works. Not with one dramatic landslide, but with steady, unnoticed shifts. And eventually, when the accusation came, the foundation had already been weakened enough to collapse. The first time Claire lied about me, it was small enough to dismiss. She accused me of taking her sweater. It was folded at the end of my bed, and I assumed she had left it there. You went into my room, she said at breakfast, her voice soft but certain. I laughed lightly. I didn't. She looked at my parents instead of at me. I guess I'm just imagining things again. That sentence did the work for her. My mother sighed, touched her hand. No one's saying that, sweetheart. My father looked at me, not angry, just measuring. Just ask next time, he said, as if I had already admitted it. I wanted to argue. I wanted to insist. But arguing in our house always felt like escalation, so I nodded. It wasn't about the sweater. It was about the shift. Over the next few months, the accusations became more subtle and more strategic. Claire would mention things in passing. Olivia's been in a weird mood lately, or, she doesn't like when I talk about my friends. None of it dramatic, none of it provable, just enough to plant something. I began noticing how quickly my parents absorbed her tone. If she was wounded, I must have done something sharp. If she was anxious, I must have said something cold. The narrative was forming quietly. And I was still playing the role of the calm one, the stable one, which made her fragility shine brighter by contrast. One afternoon, $50 went missing from my mother's purse. It was a Tuesday. Ordinary, forgettable, until it wasn't. My father called me into his office that evening. He closed the door before speaking. Did you take money from your mom? The question felt rehearsed. No. He didn't raise his voice. Claire said she saw you near her bag. I replayed my day in my head. I had left early for school. I hadn't gone near the purse. I didn't take it. He studied my face, as if truth could be extracted through pressure. You know lying makes this worse. Lying. The word entered the room before proof ever did. I felt something cold settle in my chest. It wasn't panic. It was recognition. The story had already been written. I was just being informed of my role in it. I lost my phone for a month. I was grounded from a field trip. The money was found later, tucked inside a coat pocket Claire claimed she had forgotten about. No apology followed, no correction. The incident dissolved without acknowledgement, but the label remained. Suspicion. If you've ever tried to defend yourself in a room where doubt has already been planted, you know how exhausting it becomes. You stop fighting every small fire because you're tired of proving you aren't smoke. And once doubt attaches itself to your name, it doesn't need evidence to survive, it just needs repetition, and repetition was about to become something far more dangerous. By 15, I understood something I hadn't had words for before. Claire didn't need to prove I was cruel. She only needed to suggest it consistently. And once that suggestion settled into the air of our house, everything I did filtered through it. If I was quiet, I was cold. If I disagreed, I was hostile. If I chose not to engage, I was punishing her. The shift was subtle enough that I couldn't point to a single moment and say, that's where it changed. It was erosion. And erosion rarely announces itself. There was a boy in my chemistry class named Daniel. He wasn't important in the way teenage crushes usually are. He was simply kind. We studied together twice before a midterm. That was the entire story. Claire found out because she walked past the science wing after school and saw us at the same table. That night, she barely spoke at dinner. My mother asked if she felt okay. Claire shrugged. I'm fine. Silence from her always meant something strategic was forming. 2 days later, a friend texted me. Why are you telling people Claire flirts with every guy she sees? I stared at the message, confused. I didn't. Another message followed. There are screenshots. Screenshots. My stomach tightened. When I got home, my father was waiting in the living room. My mother sat on the couch beside Claire, who looked pale and shaken. Explain this, my father said, holding out his phone. The messages were ugly, personal, detailed, sent from an account with my name and profile picture. I felt the room tilt slightly. That's not me. It's your account, he replied. Then someone used it. Even as I said it, I heard how weak it sounded. Claire's voice trembled. I didn't want to show you. I thought she'd stop. Stop what? Competing? Existing? Breathing in the same space? Why would I do that? I asked, my voice still calm, still controlled. My mother answered instead. You've seemed resentful lately. Resentful. The narrative had matured. I wasn't just distant now. I was jealous. Jealous of what? I wanted to ask. Of the protection? Of the automatic belief? But I didn't. because arguing had never shifted the outcome before. My father's disappointment deepened into something colder. "I won't tolerate cruelty in this house," he said. Cruelty. The word landed heavily. Claire slowly rolled up her sleeve. A bruise darkened her forearm. "She pushed me," she whispered. The air in the room went still. "I never touched you," I said. She didn't look at me when she answered. "On the stairs. You said you were tired of me." The accusation didn't shock me as much as my parents' immediate acceptance of it. There was no investigation, no pause, just alignment. If you've ever watched a story about you solidify in real time while you're still trying to speak, you know that helplessness. The truth doesn't evaporate. It simply becomes irrelevant. And once truth becomes irrelevant, decisions follow quickly. That night, the storm outside began to rise. And inside our house, the final decision was already forming. The decision didn't explode. It settled. That's what I remember most, how quiet it was. Thunder shook the windows. Rain streaked sideways across the glass. But inside our living room, my father's voice was controlled, almost reasonable. "I won't have this behavior under my roof," he said. Behavior. Not misunderstanding. Not confusion. Behavior. "I didn't push her," I repeated. My voice hadn't risen once. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't crying. I was standing still in the middle of the room, watching my identity be rewritten. Claire leaned into my mother, shoulders trembling. "I tried not to tell you," she whispered. "I thought she'd calm down." Calm down. As if I had been spiraling. As if I had been raging for months. "You've been distant," my mother said carefully. "Cold. We've all felt it." I searched her face for hesitation. There wasn't any. It wasn't cruelty in her eyes. It was conviction. That's what made it worse. My father stepped closer to me. "Is there something going on with you?" he asked. "Something we don't know about?" The implication was clear. I wasn't malicious. I was unstable. "I'm fine," I said quietly. "That's not what this looks like." Claire pulled her sleeve down slowly, covering the bruise. The timing felt rehearsed. And in that moment, something inside me shifted, not anger, not hatred, recognition. She knew. She knew they would choose her version. Every time. If you've ever realized that the outcome was decided before you entered the conversation, you know the strange stillness that follows. You stop trying to win. You start bracing for impact. My father turned toward the door. "You need to think about what you've done," he said. "I didn't do anything." His expression hardened. "That's exactly the problem." Lightning flashed, filling the room with white light for half a second. "You're not taking responsibility," he continued. "You're deflecting, blaming your sister. That's not normal." Not normal. The language was changing again. From jealous to cruel. Now to abnormal. "I'm not sick," I said before I could stop myself. He froze. "I didn't say you were sick." But he had, just without using the word. He opened the front door. Wind roared into the hallway. Rain hit the hardwood floor in scattered drops. "Leave," he said. The word didn't sound impulsive. It sounded final. My mother didn't stop him. She didn't say, "It's storming." She didn't say, "She's 15." She just held Claire closer. If you've ever stood in a room waiting for someone to defend you and watched them choose silence, you know how loud that silence is. I looked at my father one last time. "You're making a mistake," I said. He didn't answer. He just stepped aside. And that's how the storm finally entered the house. Because the door was open. And I was no longer welcome inside it. For a moment, I thought he would change his mind. That the open door was a tactic. A threat meant to scare me into confessing to something I hadn't done. The rain was coming down hard enough to blur the porch light into a pale halo. Wind pushed against the screen door, rattling it like something alive. "Dad," I tried once more, keeping my voice steady because steady had always been my currency in that house. "It's a storm warning." He didn't look at the sky. He looked at me. "Then, maybe you'll have time to think." Think about what? How to admit to a lie convincingly. How to apologize for a bruise I didn't leave. My mother shifted her weight but didn't step forward. Claire stayed tucked against her, silent now, no longer trembling. The performance was over. The decision had been made. I realized then that this wasn't about evidence. It was about alignment, and they had aligned with her. If you've ever understood in a single, clear instant that you are no longer being seen accurately in your own home, you know the hollow feeling that follows. Not rage, not hysteria, just vacancy. I stepped toward the doorway because refusing would only escalate things further. My father moved aside without hesitation. The cold air hit my face immediately, sharp and wet. I didn't grab much. My phone, my jacket, shoes already by the door. I kept waiting for someone to say, "Fine, come back inside." No one did. "You're overreacting," my mother said softly, as if this were my choice. That sentence stayed with me for years. I stepped onto the porch. The rain soaked through my clothes in seconds. I turned once more, not dramatically, not pleading, just to confirm whether there was any doubt left in their faces. There wasn't. My father closed the door. The sound was clean, final. The porch light clicked off. That detail hurt more than the rest, because it meant this wasn't temporary. This was removal. I walked down the driveway, into the storm, without a destination. Each step splashed through pooling water. Thunder rolled overhead, louder now that I wasn't insulated by walls. My phone buzzed with a low battery warning. 8%. I tried calling my friend Hannah. No answer. It was Friday night. People were inside. Safe. Dry. I kept walking because standing still felt worse. The streetlights flickered under the pressure of the wind. Cars passed but didn't slow. If you've ever felt the moment when home stops being a place and becomes a memory, you understand the strange calm that follows. I wasn't panicking. I was processing. Trying to reconstruct the version of myself they had just rejected. Broken, jealous, cruel. The words replayed in my head until they almost sounded plausible. When the people who raised you redefine you, it takes effort not to believe them. The bus station was 2 miles away. That felt manageable. 2 miles to warmth. 2 miles to somewhere neutral. I focused on that number as I approached the intersection ahead. The traffic light turned green. I stepped forward into the crosswalk, rain blinding my vision for half a second. I didn't see the headlights until they were almost on me. A horn blared, tires screamed against wet pavement, and then the world fractured into metal, motion, and impact. The sound wasn't what I expected. It wasn't cinematic. It wasn't a single dramatic crash. It was layered horn, brakes, the sickening thud of impact, then the rough scrape of my body hitting pavement. For a split second, there was no pain, just confusion. The sky above me flashed white with lightning, and rain fell directly into my open eyes. I couldn't tell if I was breathing. Then everything rushed in at once, the sting along my ribs, the sharp pulse at the back of my head, the metallic taste in my mouth. I heard a car door slam, footsteps splashing toward me. A man's voice, steady but urgent. "Don't move, please don't move." Hands hovered near my shoulders, not grabbing, just anchoring. "Can you hear me?" I tried to answer, but my words came out thin. I didn't see." "It's okay," he said quickly. Visibility was terrible. The roads flooded. "Stay still." He sounded controlled, not defensive, not panicked in a way that felt chaotic, focused. I felt his jacket settle gently over me, shielding my face from the rain. "I'm calling 911, he added. I heard the operator's voice faintly through the storm. 15-year-old female, conscious but disoriented, severe weather conditions, 15-year-old. The phrase landed somewhere distant. I hadn't thought about my age when I stepped out into the rain. Suddenly it mattered. "Where are your parents?" he asked carefully after ending the call. The question felt heavier than the pain. "They don't want me," I whispered. It wasn't dramatic. It was factual. There was a pause. Not disbelief. Not suspicion. Just silence that felt different from the silence at home. This silence was absorbing information, not dismissing it. "You're not alone right now," he said firmly. "Stay with me." Sirens grew louder in the distance. Red and blue lights cut through the rain. Paramedics moved quickly, professional and efficient. One checked my pupils. Another stabilized my neck. "What's your name?" someone asked. "Olivia," saying it felt important. As they lifted me onto the stretcher, I saw the driver clearly for the first time. Mid-40s, composed, rain-soaked hair pressed back from his forehead. Not reckless, not careless. Just shaken in a contained way. "I'm going with her," he told the paramedics. "You family?" one of them asked. "No," he said. "But I'm not leaving." Those words cut through the noise more sharply than the sirens. I drifted in and out inside the ambulance. Bright interior lights. Oxygen mask. The steady rhythm of instructions. My body felt distant, like something being transported separately from me. Before everything faded fully, I heard his voice again. Calm. Close. "You're safe now, Olivia." Safe. It was a foreign word, but I held on to it as the darkness finally closed in. When I woke up, the storm was gone. Not faded gone. The air inside the hospital room was controlled, filtered, quiet. Machines hummed steadily beside me. My ribs ached when I tried to breathe too deeply, and there was a dull pressure at the back of my head that reminded me something had split open and been carefully sealed again. For a moment, I didn't remember why I was there. Then the door, the rain, the headlights. It all returned in fragments. He was sitting in the chair beside my bed, jacket folded neatly over the armrest now, posture upright but not rigid. He looked like someone accustomed to responsibility. When he noticed my eyes open, he didn't rush toward me. "You're awake," he said, voice calm, the same tone he'd used in the street. "You have a concussion and a couple of cracked ribs. They're keeping you overnight." Overnight. The word felt safer than I expected. "You stayed," I said quietly. "Yes." No elaboration, no explanation about guilt or obligation. Just, yes. A nurse entered briefly, checked the monitors, asked if I felt dizzy. When she left, the room returned to its measured stillness. "The police are contacting your parents," he said carefully. I swallowed. That sentence carried weight. "You told them?" "I told them a minor was found alone during a severe weather advisory," he replied. Not accusing, just factual. He folded his hands together. "Olivia, I need to ask you something. Do you feel safe going home?" No one had ever asked me that before. Not teachers, not neighbors, not family. Safe. I stared at the ceiling tiles, at the small cracks in their pattern. "No," I said. It didn't tremble. It didn't collapse. It landed clearly between us. He nodded once, as if that answer aligned with something he had already suspected. "Then we'll make sure you don't have to." "We." The word felt unfamiliar in a way that almost hurt. I studied him more carefully now. He wore no hospital badge, but he carried himself like someone used to institutional spaces. "Who are you?" I asked. A faint smile crossed his face. "Nathaniel Harper." The name hovered in my memory, distant but recognizable. Dean of Graduate Studies at State University. The pieces shifted into place slowly. I had seen that name before, printed on scholarship announcements, quoted in education articles my father once admired. Before I could process that connection fully, there was a knock at the door. Footsteps in the hallway. Familiar ones. My father's voice, tight and controlled. "Where is she?" The door opened. My parents stepped inside, Claire behind them. And for the first time since the storm began, the balance in the room was no longer tilted against me, because my father wasn't looking at me first. He was staring at the man sitting beside my bed, and I watched certainty drain from his face. The room changed temperature without anyone touching the thermostat. My father stepped inside first, shoulders squared, ready to control whatever narrative he thought was unfolding. My mother followed, tense but composed. Claire lingered slightly behind them, her expression carefully neutral, and then my father saw him. Nathaniel Harper stood slowly from the chair beside my bed, not in confrontation, not in performance, just standing, calm, grounded. My father's confidence faltered in real time. "Dr. Harper?" he said, voice tightening around the name. It wasn't disbelief that shook him, it was recognition. He knew exactly who was standing there. Years earlier, I had heard him quote Harper at dinner articles about education reform, leadership, institutional integrity. He had respected him from a distance. Now that same man was in a hospital room beside the daughter he had sent into a storm. "Mr. Bennett," Dr. Harper replied evenly. "No hostility, no edge, just acknowledgement." The silence stretched long enough to feel deliberate. "We received a call from the police," my father said finally, trying to regain footing. "There's been some confusion." Confusion. The word floated weakly in the sterile air. "Your daughter was found alone during a severe weather advisory," Dr. Harper said calmly. "She was struck by my vehicle due to limited visibility and flooded roads. I called emergency services immediately." The statement was precise, responsible, transparent. It left no room for speculation. My mother gasped softly at the word struck, her hand flying to her mouth. Claire's eyes darted toward me, then away. "She shouldn't have been outside," Dr. Harper continued, voice steady but firm. "She is 15. The number carried weight in a way it hadn't at home. 15 was not dramatic. It was legal. It was protective." A police officer stepped in behind my parents, notebook in hand. "Mr. Bennett, can you clarify why your minor child was outside alone at 11 p.m. during a storm advisory?" The question wasn't aggressive. It was procedural. My father hesitated, a rare thing. "It was a disciplinary matter," he said. The officer's pen paused. "Did you intend to endanger her?" There it was. Not accusation. Just implication. My father's jaw tightened. "Of course not." Dr. Harper didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. The contrast was already visible. Authority rooted in ego versus authority rooted in responsibility. I lay there listening, ribs aching with each breath, but something inside me steadied. For the first time that night, the narrative wasn't being shaped in our living room. It was being examined under fluorescent lights, with witnesses. "Olivia," the officer asked gently, turning toward me, "do you feel safe returning home tonight?" The question echoed the one Dr. Harper had already asked. My parents' eyes locked onto me. I felt the weight of their expectation, the unspoken request to restore normalcy, to minimize, to smooth it over. For years I had chosen the easier answer, the stabilizing one. But lying had never protected me. It had only delayed impact. "No," I said. The word didn't crack. It didn't apologize. It settled into the room like fact. And for the first time, no one tried to rewrite it. After I said no, the room did not explode. No one gasped. No one argued. The silence that followed was heavier than shouting would have been. My father looked as though he had been publicly corrected in a language he didn't fully understand. My mother's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't contradict me. Claire stared at the floor, her hands clasped together, as if she were the one waiting for judgment now. The officer nodded slowly and wrote something down. "We'll involve a social worker," he said. "Given the circumstances, we need to ensure appropriate placement." Placement. The word sounded clinical, detached from emotion, but it carried protection inside it. "That won't be necessary," my father replied quickly. "This was a misunderstanding." Dr. Harper spoke for the first time since my answer. "A misunderstanding does not result in a minor walking alone during a severe weather advisory." His tone wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. It was precise. Calm authority carries differently than anger. The officer glanced between them. "Sir, we're obligated to follow protocol." Protocol. Another word that shifted power away from personal opinion and toward structure. For years, everything inside our house had depended on perception, on tone, on tears. Now, we were inside a system that required documentation. My father seemed to recognize that shift too. He exhaled slowly, as if recalibrating. "Olivia," he said, turning to me, his voice softer now, almost careful. "You don't have to make this bigger than it is." Bigger than it is. I looked at him and felt something unexpected, not anger, not fear, clarity. For him, this was escalation. For me, it was alignment. "It already is big," I said quietly. My ribs protested the effort of speaking, but I didn't stop. "You told me to leave." The words hung in the sterile air. No embellishment, no accusation, just fact. My mother's shoulders slumped slightly. Claire shifted her weight but didn't speak. Dr. Harper didn't look at them. He looked at me. Olivia, he said evenly, if you prefer, I am willing to provide temporary housing until the social worker determines a longer-term solution. He said it the way someone offers structure. Not rescue. My father's head snapped toward him. That's not appropriate. It is, the officer replied before Harper could. With supervision and documentation. The authority in the room had subtly changed hands. I felt it settle. If you've ever experienced someone in power choosing to protect you instead of dismiss you, you know how disorienting that can be. Protection feels unfamiliar when you've been trained to minimize yourself. I closed my eyes briefly, letting the steady beep of the monitor anchor me. When I opened them, I met Dr. Harper's gaze. There was no pressure there, just steadiness. I would like that, I said. The decision did not feel dramatic. It felt necessary. And for the first time that night, necessary did not require permission. The social worker arrived the next morning just after sunrise. The storm had passed completely by then, leaving the world outside the hospital windows washed and deceptively calm. Her name was Mrs. Alvarez, and she spoke in the kind of steady tone that suggested she had walked into many rooms like this before. She didn't begin with accusations. She began with questions. Olivia, can you tell me what happened last night? I told her the facts. Not dramatically, not defensively. The accusation, the door, the storm. I didn't exaggerate the bruise or speculate about how it got there. I simply described what I had experienced. She listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding, occasionally writing something down. When she finished, she turned to my parents and asked the same question. Their version was softer, concerned, framed as discipline that went too far. But even softened, the facts didn't change. I had been told to leave. I had left. Given the conditions and Olivia's age, Mrs. Alvarez said carefully, temporary alternative placement is appropriate while we assess the home environment. Home environment. The phrase felt clinical, but it also felt validating. What had happened was not just emotional, it was environmental. Dr. Harper remained quiet during most of the conversation. He didn't interrupt, he didn't advocate loudly. He simply confirmed that he was willing to provide temporary housing with oversight and documentation. My father objected at first, citing reputation, misunderstanding, family privacy. Mrs. Alvarez listened politely and then responded with the same calm firmness the officer had used the night before. This is about safety, not reputation. That sentence shifted something fundamental. For years, reputation had outweighed reality in our house. Now reality had precedence. When she asked me again if I felt safe returning home immediately, I answered the same way. No, it was easier this time. Repetition builds confidence. Claire remained silent throughout the meeting. I didn't look at her much, not because I hated her, because I was tired. Tired of reading her expressions for strategy, tired of anticipating the next narrative. After the paperwork was completed, my parents left the hospital with clipped movements and tight expressions. There were no dramatic apologies, no emotional reconciliations, just distance. And strangely, that felt cleaner than anything else had. By late afternoon, discharge papers were signed. My ribs were wrapped, my head throbbed in steady pulses, but I was stable. Dr. Harper drove me from the hospital himself. The city looked different from the passenger seat, wider, less threatening. He didn't fill the silence with reassurance. He didn't say everything would be okay. He simply drove, one hand steady on the wheel, as if this were an ordinary responsibility. When we pulled into his driveway, the porch light was already on, though it was still early evening. You can stay as long as you need, he said, not dramatically, not heroically. Just fact. For the first time since the storm began, I stepped through a doorway without feeling like I had to defend my presence. And that quiet shift felt larger than anything that had happened the night before. The first night in Dr. Harper's house felt unfamiliar in a way I couldn't immediately name. It wasn't luxurious. It wasn't intimidating. It was simply stable. The guest room had pale walls, a desk by the window, and a bookshelf lined with titles about education reform and leadership theory. Clean sheets, a folded blanket at the foot of the bed. Nothing extravagant, just prepared. You can change anything you'd like, he said, setting my small hospital bag near the dresser. This is your space for now. For now didn't sound temporary in a threatening way. It sounded measured, structured. I nodded, unsure how to respond to that kind of calm generosity. In my house growing up, generosity often came with commentary. This didn't. He didn't ask for gratitude. He didn't ask for explanation. He simply left the door open halfway when he walked down the hall, a small gesture that communicated both privacy and proximity. That first night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I felt unsafe, because my body was still adjusting. When you've been bracing for impact, it takes time to recognize that the impact has passed. The next morning, he made coffee and set a glass of orange juice across from the chair at the kitchen table. There's cereal in the cabinet, he said. And we'll schedule a follow-up appointment for your concussion. No interrogation, no probing questions about Claire, just logistics, structure again. Over the next few days, arrangements began to solidify. Mrs. Alvarez scheduled therapy sessions. My school transfer paperwork was initiated quietly, without spectacle. Doctor Harper explained each step as if I were capable of understanding institutional processes, which I was. That respect mattered more than reassurance would have. You'll need continuity, he said one afternoon, reviewing forms at the dining room table. Disruption is destabilizing. We minimize disruption. Minimize disruption. The language was practical, not emotional. I realized slowly that stability isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with speeches. It arrives with calendars, follow-up appointments, predictable dinner times. We ate at 6:30 every evening. Not because it was strict, because it was consistent. And consistency began repairing something in me that I hadn't realized was fractured. At school, word of my absence spread briefly, then faded. My new school didn't know the narrative Claire had built. I was simply Olivia, a quiet student with good grades and a concussion excuse for gym class. That neutrality felt like relief. I didn't have to defend myself from a version of me that no longer existed outside one household. Sometimes at night, when the house was quiet, I replayed the moment my father closed the door. The memory still hurt, but it no longer distorted me. It became a fact instead of a verdict. One evening, about a week after I moved in, Dr. Harper placed a brochure on the table beside my plate. State University's Summer Research Program. I looked up at him. You should apply, he said. No build-up, no explanation, just expectation. For a moment, I almost laughed. A week earlier, I had been standing in the rain with nowhere to go. Now someone was asking me to consider a university research program. The contrast was disorienting. I don't know if I'd get in, I admitted. He held my gaze evenly. Apply. Not pressure, not fantasy, just quiet belief. And I realized something important in that moment. Being chosen doesn't erase what happened, but it changes what happens next. Applying to the State University Summer Research Program felt unreal at first, like I was filling out forms for someone braver than me. The application asked about academic interests, long-term goals, research questions I wanted to explore. I hesitated over that last section. For years, my focus had been survival, keeping peace, minimizing conflict, avoiding escalation. Now I had to articulate curiosity. It felt almost indulgent. Doctor Harper didn't sit beside me while I filled it out. He stayed in his office down the hall, grading papers, giving me space. That space mattered. It meant he believed I could do this without supervision. When I finished the essay, I asked if he would read it. He didn't correct my voice. He didn't rewrite my sentences. He circled one paragraph and said, "This is where you sound most like yourself. Expand here. No flattery, no overpraise, just refinement." I submitted the application on a quiet Thursday evening. For the first time in months, I felt anticipation that wasn't tied to fear. While I waited, life at his house continued with steady rhythm. Therapy sessions began once a week. My therapist didn't focus only on the storm. She asked about patterns, about identity, about what it means to be labeled something repeatedly. When someone calls you broken long enough, she said gently, your brain starts looking for cracks. That sentence stayed with me. I had been scanning myself for flaws I couldn't see. As if the accusation must have come from somewhere. Slowly, I began untangling that reflex. Claire had needed to be fragile. My parents had needed someone stable to counterbalance that fragility. I had filled that role. When the balance shifted, I became the disruption. Understanding that didn't excuse what happened, but it clarified it. And clarity feels different than blame. 2 weeks later, an email arrived. Congratulations. I read the word 3 times before it settled into meaning. I had been accepted, not because someone pitied me, not because of my circumstances, because of my application, my ideas, my work. I walked into the kitchen, where Dr. Harper was making tea. I got in, I said, trying to keep my voice level. He smiled, not broadly, not theatrically, just enough to acknowledge achievement. Good, he replied. Now you'll need to prepare. Prepare. That was the language of growth, not rescue. That summer, walking across the university campus for the first time, I felt something shift inside me. The buildings were solid, the air filled with conversation and purpose. No one there knew the story of the storm. I was simply a student, curious, capable, present. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't shrinking to keep anyone else comfortable. The summer program was harder than I expected, but not in the way hardship had felt before. This difficulty was clean, academic, measurable. Long days in the research lab, articles stacked with language I had to read twice, sometimes 3 times, before it settled into clarity. I was assigned to a small team studying educational access disparities in rural districts, datasets, policy frameworks, long-term retention analysis. It was structured complexity, not emotional chaos. And for the first time, I realized my mind liked structure. It liked tracing patterns, identifying inconsistencies, building models that made sense of systems. Pain had trained me to observe quietly. Now observation had purpose. Dr. Harper did not treat me differently on campus. He introduced me to colleagues simply as Olivia, one of our summer researchers, not as a girl he'd taken in, not as a cautionary tale. That restraint was a form of respect. I moved through the program as myself, not as someone's project. Sometimes I caught glimpses of families touring the campus, parents pointing at buildings, explaining futures to their children. I felt a brief flicker of something, not envy, not quite sadness, just awareness. My path had rerouted. It wasn't lined with tradition or expectation. It was self-constructed. And self-constructed paths are often sturdier, because you know exactly how they were built. One afternoon, my team presented preliminary findings to faculty. I stood at the front of the room explaining retention correlations and funding gaps, and I didn't tremble. Months earlier, I had stood in a living room defending my character against a bruise I didn't cause. Now I was defending data, evidence. My voice carried clearly. That shift felt profound. If you've ever moved from defending yourself to defending your ideas, you understand how different that posture feels. One is reactive, the other is intentional. By the end of the program, I wasn't just surviving stability, I was growing inside it. When the closing ceremony concluded, Dr. Harper handed me a small envelope. Inside was a note. You don't belong in survival mode, it read. You belong in systems that value clarity. I folded the note carefully and kept it. That fall, I returned to high school with something I hadn't carried before: internal steadiness. Word had reached me indirectly that things at home were tense. Claire had struggled socially. My parents were quieter in community gatherings. I didn't seek details. Distance was not punishment, it was boundary. Healing had begun, but it was still early. I focused on grades, on applications, on building a future not anchored to accusation. And for the first time, I understood that what happened in that storm did not have to define me. It could simply redirect me. Senior year arrived quietly. There was no dramatic turning point, no visible marker that separated the girl who had stood in the rain from the one filling out college applications at Dr. Harper's dining room table. But internally, something had solidified. I no longer introduced myself to myself through accusation. I wasn't the jealous sister. I wasn't the unstable daughter. I was a student with a transcript full of evidence grades, research credits, recommendation letters written by teachers who described me as focused, thoughtful, disciplined. Words that felt almost foreign when placed beside the ones I had been called at home. College essays asked about adversity. I hesitated before writing about the storm. Not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't want it to become spectacle. Trauma can easily become narrative currency. I refused to spend it that way. Instead, I wrote about systems, about how educational structures often overlook students navigating instability. I wrote about clarity, about how misinterpretation can become institutionalized if no one challenges it, I wrote, in my own voice. Doctor. Harper reviewed the draft and simply said, "You're not asking for sympathy, you're presenting insight. Keep that." Acceptance letters began arriving in early spring. Thin envelopes. Thick envelopes. Scholarship offers. Invitations to honors programs. Each one felt like a quiet affirmation, not of survival but of direction. I chose State University, not because of Dr. Harper, not because of the hospital room, because it aligned with what I was building. I declared a major in education policy before I even stepped onto campus as a freshman. Patterns had shaped my life long enough. I wanted to understand how to reshape them. Before graduation from high school, there was one final court review regarding my placement, Mrs. Alvarez recommended continued guardianship through my first year of college, given stability and documented progress. My parents attended that meeting. They looked different, not defeated, not hostile, just subdued. They spoke about regret, about misjudgment. They didn't contest the recommendation. Claire didn't attend. I didn't ask why. When the judge finalized the extension, it felt less like a victory and more like administrative closure. There was no celebration afterward. Just paperwork signed and quiet acknowledgement that the structure now reflected reality. On graduation night, I wore a cap and gown that didn't feel heavy. I spotted my parents in the crowd from a distance. They clapped when my name was called. I didn't search for their approval. I didn't avoid their gaze either. I simply walked across the stage and accepted the diploma. That gesture meant more than applause ever could. Afterward, Dr. Harper shook my hand like he would any other graduate. "Onward," he said. Not sentimental, not dramatic, just forward. And that's exactly what I felt, not rescued, not avenged, just moving steadily towards something I had built piece by piece, beginning the night the door closed behind me. College did not feel like escape. It felt like calibration. The campus was large enough to hold anonymity, but structured enough to provide direction. I moved into a dorm my freshman year instead of staying at Dr. Harper's house, not because I needed distance from him, but because independence had become part of the architecture we were building. He didn't protest the decision. He helped me carry boxes up 2 flights of stairs, and left after making sure I knew how to access the student portal and campus health services. "Call if you need structure," he said lightly. "Not if you need saving." Structure. My classes in education policy demanded a different kind of thinking, not personal, not reactive, but systemic. We analyzed funding inequities, school discipline statistics, dropout patterns tied to housing instability. Each lecture felt like language forming around experiences I had once survived without vocabulary. When professors spoke about displacement risk factors, I listened not as a victim, but as a case study with agency. The difference mattered. I joined a research assistantship my second semester, helping compile data on students who withdrew mid-year due to family breakdown. Numbers began to tell a familiar story. Patterns of silence. Delayed intervention. Institutional blind spots. Instead of feeling triggered, I felt focused. Clarity has a grounding effect. One evening, after a long day of reviewing attrition reports, I walked back across campus under a sky that threatened rain. The air smelled like it had that night years ago. For a split second, memory surfaced, porch light clicking off, thunder rolling. But the memory didn't destabilize me, it contextualized me. I was no longer standing outside a door waiting to be let back in. I was inside a system learning how to redesign doors entirely. If you've ever returned to a memory and realized it no longer controls your nervous system, you understand how profound that shift can be. It's not erasure, it's integration. During my sophomore year, I drafted a proposal for a pilot emergency grant program aimed at students facing sudden housing displacement. It wasn't yet the initiative it would become later, but it was the blueprint. I presented it to a faculty advisory board with hands that didn't shake. Some members questioned feasibility. Others asked about liability. I answered carefully, using data, not emotion. The proposal wasn't approved immediately, but it wasn't dismissed either. That alone felt significant. Growth isn't loud, it's iterative. When I returned to Dr. Harper's house for dinner occasionally, the dynamic had shifted naturally. I was no longer the girl in the guest room. I was a college student discussing policy frameworks across his kitchen table. And somewhere between research drafts and late-night study sessions, I realized something quietly transformative. The storm had not ended my story. It had introduced me to the work I was meant to do. By junior year, the blueprint had grown into something tangible. The emergency grant proposal I had drafted as a sophomore was no longer just a classroom exercise. After revisions, budget modeling, and months of committee review, the university agreed to pilot a small-scale version of it. 5 students, limited funds, strict reporting requirements. It was modest, but it was real. I remember sitting in the administrative conference room when the approval was finalized. No applause, no dramatic announcement, just signatures and procedural next steps. Still, my hands rested on the table a little differently that day. Steadier. The work began quietly. Applications came in from students who described unexpected family conflict or temporary housing instability. The language was cautious, familiar. I recognized the restraint in their wording. People learn to soften their crises when they've been told they're overreacting. I reviewed each application carefully, separating urgency from exaggeration, fact from fear. It wasn't about suspicion, it was about structure. We approved the first grant within 3 weeks. The student who received it didn't cry in my office. He nodded once, thanked me, and asked about repayment expectations. There were none. This is stabilization, I told him, not debt. That distinction mattered. As the pilot continued, data began forming around outcomes. Retention improved. Academic performance stabilized. Faculty advisors reported fewer mid-semester withdrawals. The numbers confirmed what intuition had suggested. Small, timely interventions prevent larger collapses. It wasn't dramatic work. It was preventative. Around that time, I received an email from Claire. It was the first direct message since the hospital. Short, direct. I've been thinking about everything. I'm sorry. No long explanation, no defensive framing, just acknowledgement. I stared at the message longer than I expected to. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel relief. I felt distance. Forgiveness had already begun privately, but reconciliation is a different structure. I responded carefully. I hope you're taking care of yourself. That was honest. Not open-ended. Not closed. Somewhere in between. If you've ever received an apology years after the damage, you understand the complexity of that moment. It doesn't rewrite history. It simply acknowledges it. Back on campus, the pilot program gained attention beyond our department. A regional education conference invited me to present preliminary findings. Standing at that podium, I spoke about displacement patterns, intervention timing, long-term outcomes. I did not mention the storm. I did not mention my father's voice in the doorway. Those details were not necessary. The work spoke for itself. And as I concluded the presentation, I realized something quietly profound. The night I was told to leave had redirected me into rooms I never would have entered otherwise, not as a victim, as a builder. And builders, I was learning, don't shout when foundations shift, they reinforce them. The pilot program was never meant to grow quickly. It was cautious by design, 5 students, limited funding, strict documentation. But by the end of the academic year, the numbers were undeniable. None of the students who received emergency stabilization funding had withdrawn. Their grades held steady. 2 improved. Faculty advisors began asking whether the program would continue. Data has a quiet authority. When I presented the results to the advisory board, I didn't tell a personal story. I showed retention curves, intervention timelines, cost comparisons between short-term grants and long-term attrition loss. "We're not funding crises," I said calmly. "We're preventing collapse." That sentence shifted the room. Within months, the university approved expansion campus-wide under a formal name, the Second Path Initiative. Hearing those words spoken in an official board meeting felt surreal. Years earlier, I had drafted that phrase at a dining table, trying to understand my own displacement. Now it carried institutional backing. Media interest followed in small waves. I agreed to one interview and kept it measured. When asked what inspired the initiative, I answered simply, "I've seen what instability does to capable students." That was enough. Around the same time, my mother sent a brief email. "We heard your program is expanding. We're proud of you." The words didn't sting. They didn't swell. They just existed. And for the first time, their pride wasn't oxygen. It was optional. The work no longer depended on being understood by them. It depended on being built correctly. And that was something I could control. Expansion never feels dramatic from the inside. It feels administrative. Emails, budget approvals, training sessions in fluorescent conference rooms. But steady growth has its own quiet gravity. Within 2 years, the initiative operated in multiple universities. Over 100 students received stabilization grants. Housing agreements were formalized. Faculty liaisons were trained to identify early displacement risk. The system began responding before crises escalated. That was the point. During one training session, a dean asked me why housing instability mattered more than other variables. "Because when a student loses housing," I said, "everything else destabilizes next." It wasn't personal. It was structural. By then, I had stopped thinking of the storm as trauma and started thinking of it as origin, not in a romantic way, in a factual one. It redirected me into work I wouldn't have chosen otherwise. Claire emailed occasionally. Short updates. Therapy. Changing majors. Learning not to compete for attention. I read her messages without resentment. I also read them without responsibility. Healing is individual work. Mine had taken time. Hers would too. If you've ever reached a point where someone else's growth no longer feels like your assignment, you understand the relief in that shift. I didn't need reconciliation to move forward. I needed alignment. And alignment had already happened. The door that closed years ago had forced me toward rooms built on structure instead of perception. And structure holds. There is a kind of healing that doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't arrive with apologies that fix everything. It doesn't come with a reunion scene or a perfectly worded letter. It shows up quietly in your nervous system. Years after the storm, I drove past my old neighborhood by accident. A navigation reroute. A wrong turn that wasn't really wrong. The street looked ordinary. Lawns trimmed. Mailboxes straight. The porch where I once stood in the rain was still there, painted a different color now. The light fixture had been replaced. The house looked smaller. Not tragic. Not powerful. Just smaller. I waited for something to happen inside me. A tightening, a pull, a memory sharp enough to sting. Nothing did. I kept driving. And that's when I understood something fully for the first time. The storm no longer lived in my body. The Second Path Initiative now operated in more universities than I could have imagined when I first drafted the outline at a dining table. Hundreds of students had received emergency stabilization grants. Retention data continued to strengthen. Policy discussions were happening at levels far above anything I once thought accessible. But the most meaningful part wasn't scale. It was continuity. Students who would have withdrawn stayed enrolled. Students who would have disappeared quietly graduated. Students who once filled out applications using softened language for their crisis moved forward without having to explain themselves twice. No one there knew my story. They didn't need to. The system held without it. My parents still send holiday cards. The messages are brief. I respond when it feels grounded to do so. Claire writes occasionally updates about therapy, about learning how to exist without competing for protection. I read her messages without resentment. I also read them without urgency. Forgiveness settled inside me years ago. Access remains measured. They are not the same. If you've ever reached a place where someone's approval is no longer oxygen, you understand the steadiness that follows. It isn't triumph. It isn't superiority. It's freedom. Dr. Harper and I still meet for dinner sometimes. We talk about scaling models, about sustainability, about the next phase of expansion. We rarely mention the hospital night. We don't need to. It was not a miracle. It was a hinge. A door closed. Another opened. Broken things collapse under pressure. But I was never broken. I was misnamed. And when the door shut behind me, I stepped into a different architecture. If you're listening from somewhere quiet tonight, maybe in a room that doesn't feel safe yet, maybe in a car outside a place you're not ready to enter, remember this. Someone else's certainty about you is not the same as truth. You are not what they decided in a moment of fear. You are what you build after that moment passes. And sometimes, the storm that removed you is the same storm that repositions you. Not for revenge, for direction. And that is more than enough.